Could the disabled children whose mums took the anti-epilepsy drug Valproate finally be set to receive compensation? A new report calls on the government to make initial payments of £100,000 to those harmed by Valproate because some women were not told of the risks taking it could pose. Good evening. Spina bifida, impaired hearing, autism, heart problems, reduced IQ. Those are some of the conditions children are living with after their mums took an anti-epilepsy drug called Valproate. And many of these mums say they were not warned of the risks of taking the drug while trying to conceive or during their pregnancies. Risks known as long ago as the early 1970s. Tonight, England's Patient Safety Commissioner, who has been commissioned by the government to look into possible compensation, says the Valproate scandal is bigger than thalidomide, referring to the severe birth defects caused by a morning sickness drug which was licensed in the 50s in the UK. Here's Kate.
Tonight, the Patient Safety Commissioner has called for the government to urgently set up a fund for those harmed by the drug sodium valproate. So let's talk about how we got here. It was back in the 1970s that Valproate first started to be used. Today, tens of thousands of people in the UK take the drug to manage epilepsy, bipolar disorder, and in a small number of cases, migraines. And we've got to remember Valproate is an essential medication for many. For some, it will be the only drug which controls their seizures. But even at the early stages, there was data shared with licensing authorities which suggested Valproate could affect fetal development in animals, indicating potential risks for pregnant women. And this was passed on to medics. When the first data sheet was published for those prescribing Valproate, it warned in women of childbearing age the product should only be used in severe cases or in those resistant to other treatment. By the 1980s, academics had started publishing research looking at the effects on children born to those taking the drug. Today, it suggested 11% of the children of women who take Valproate during pregnancy have major congenital disorders. In the general population, that figure would be much lower, around 2 or 3%. And 30 to 40% of children born to women taking this drug also experience delays in early development, as well as poor language skills, memory problems, and lower intellectual abilities. There's also an increased risk of autism spectrum disorder and ADHD. Now here, I'm going to skip forwards 20 years to talk about efforts to get compensation. Because in 2004, a group of families launched legal action against the drug's manufacturer. That case was due to be heard at the High Court, but families were devastated when in 2010 legal aid was withdrawn and the case discontinued.
The legal aid 3 weeks before the court case was due, they pulled out, they pulled the funding. And after 6 years of funding it, we seem to be very confused and we don't understand why.
As investigations into the risks posed by Valproate continued and regulations were tightened, some countries did start to take further actions on the issue of compensation. In 2016, French politicians voted to create a €10 million compensation scheme for families. But a year later, a minister at the Department of Health said there were no plans for the UK to follow suit. He stressed support for families with children born with a disability was already available. More recently, an independent review led by Baroness Cumberledge recommended a scheme should be set up to meet the cost of additional care for those who'd experienced avoidable harm, a recommendation the government chose not to accept. Instead, the government said it worked with the litigation arm of the NHS Resolution, to create a simpler gateway for those affected to claim compensation. To succeed, families would still need to pass strict legal tests, including showing that the medics treating them acted in a way contrary to the proper practice at the time. Not always easy. Between 1994 and 2018, the NHS received almost 120 of these claims. 6 were settled. And this is the crux of the matter. Making these legal claims can be an expensive, stressful and lengthy process with no guarantee of success. Which is why in recent years there have been louder calls for a simpler redress scheme. A Health and Social Care Committee report last year found families have already waited too long. Which brings us back to tonight, and another independent review calling for urgent action to correct what they call a question of justice.